Good afternoon, everyone. I can understand it's late afternoon, so let me say it one more time. Good afternoon, everyone. All right, we also have some good coffee in the back here to get you through the rest of the day. My name is Brahima Coulibaly. I'm the Vice President of the Global Economy and Development Program. And it really gives me great pleasure to welcome you all, both here and online, for this event on navigating the mid-transition period of low carbon shift and the critical role of finance ministries. I know there are no shortage of events around town, so again, really grateful that you could spend the late afternoon here with us. I should note that this event is in partnership with the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action and the Coalition for Capacity on Climate Action, also known as C3A. So on the topic of climate change itself, I think it's arguably the most urgent threat to our lives and livelihoods. And the science on this is very clear. In the coming years, rising global temperatures will lead to more frequent and severe weather events, and the degradation of the world oceans and other ecosystems, and instability in access to food and drinking water, among others. So notwithstanding some progress over the past years, I think it's also clear that we need much more progress to deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement, and then progress there has fallen significantly short. And there's really growing consensus that the next years will present a critical last window of opportunity to ramp up efforts at all levels. So the transition to low carbon economy is complex and multifaceted transformation process that is fraught with challenges and opportunities, unfolding against the backdrop of global economic uncertainty and energy security concerns. As the impact of climate change intensifies, countries face a trilemma between sustainability, affordability, and energy security. So innovations and green investments are reshaping the energy landscape, reducing costs and boosting productivity in low-carbon sectors. So this leads us into a mid-transition period where fossil fuel and low-carbon systems coexist with potential tension. For developing countries, low-carbon transition represents a historic opportunity to leapfrog, avoiding some of the mistakes and costs of the old growth path and the benefit from new and better forms of growth. But the large investment requirement and structural change that will come with it means that they must ensure a just transition, mobilizing the necessary scale of finance at a reasonable cost. The international community, including the multilateral development banks and advanced countries, have a key role to play in helping support and finance the acceleration in investment and the accompanying policy changes that are now necessary. And understanding the dynamics of this mid-transition period is essential for creating conditions for an accelerating shift in low-carbon economy. Ministries of Finance play a critical role through the power of the purse as they oversee revenues and expenditures of all government departments, but they also play a pivotal role in leveraging opportunities and mitigating risk during this mid-transition. So the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, which now boasts more than 90 finance ministers, has been an effective global vector of coordination of finance ministries on climate action, both in terms of domestic enhancement of capabilities and international support for action. This would not have been possible without the leadership of the co-chairs, and we are honored to have with us Her Excellency, Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Minister of Finance of Indonesia and co-chair of the coalition. She's one of the most respected finance ministers in the world and has played a leadership role in many capacities, including as managing director of the World Bank and executive director at the IMF. Under her leadership, the coalition has become a key body driving more ambitious climate action. And as finance minister, she has been playing a leading role in Indonesia's own just energy transition program. So there's no better speaker today to address us on this topic of navigating the mid-transition and the role of finance ministers. So Minister Indrawati, thank you for lending your leadership to the climate agenda and for spending the afternoon with us. In terms of the agenda for the rest of the event, we'll first hear from Minister Indrawati, will provide some remarks, which will then be followed by a panel of distinguished speakers and moderated by my colleague, Amar Batashara, who is Senior Fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program. And you'll have an opportunity at the end to ask questions. So with that, please join me and welcome Her Excellency to the podium.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me to provide the keynotes and also sharing of the Indonesia experience in navigating and managing a very complex transition. We all know that the transition toward reducing for Indonesia energy sector, which is mainly based on coal-fired power plants and also other fossil fuel, and also at the same time enhancing a low-carbon energy system is a very complex process. It's also difficult politically and socially. The transition must be prioritizing on the principle of energy affordability and also fairness. We also discuss about how we are going to be able to continue growing. Just to give you a little bit recognition about the Indonesia size, the economy with 1.4 trillion US dollar GDP size, 270 million population, live it's more than 100,000 island. This is not the salad dressing, it's really 1,000 island for the Indonesia. And that's create more complex in terms of first, providing energy for all, for the people, and at the same time transition toward more green energy. The projection of the global green transition costs varies significantly, spanning from 100 trillion US dollar to 300 trillion US dollar until 2050. And this translates to annual net investment of 2 to 8% of global GDP. And this is require a lot of mobilization of resources, especially during this current situation with the higher for longer interest rate for many emerging and developing countries becoming even more critical. We also understand that the cost of inaction is much bigger. The decisive measure to reduce emission, if it is not being taken in the long run, the cost would be far exceeding for comparing to the recognized costs at this moment, especially in designing the transition. So how Indonesia is one of the emerging country which is continue developing with around 5% growth for 2 decades, and the demand for energy will continue growing. We can fulfilling this demand for energy and at the same time also transforming into a more green energy. Energy security is becoming one of the big issue for a country which have a choice like Indonesia, in which we have a geothermal with a capacity of more 29 gigawatt, hydro, as well as solar and wind. These are all combined can be much bigger. But the problem is how we are going to make sure that this renewable can be put or can be built and then transmitted into the demand side. Indonesia is already providing a Paris national determined contribution, which is reducing the CO2 commitment of 29% or even increase, enhanced by 31% without support from the global, and to 42% with the support of the global. And this will cost around 281 billion US dollar. The big chunk of this cost is for the energy transition, around 245 billion US dollar. So for a country with this 1.4 trillion and the budget which is around 250 billion, this sum of money cannot be relied on the public funding. So the public funding will contribute around 14%. the role of private sector is becoming very critical. Indonesia also launching the phasing out or accelerating coal phase down scenario that will cost us 168 billion for our state-owned company, that is PLN, the electricity company. So when this forum is asking about the role of finance minister, the first thing in your mind, as Brahim mentioned, is about money, of course. But this money itself cannot be rely on the public. But without public money, I can assure you that there will be no private sector money that will jump in and then participating in this very complex transition. So the Ministry of Finance role in providing the right policy framework and developing more, what you call it, instrument, as well as the policy that can leverage the public money and providing the right incentive for the private sector philanthropists to work together into a one good, sound, blended finance is very critical. Indonesia, in this case, during the G20 presidency in 2022, initiated Energy Transition Mechanism, or ETM, and we launched the country platform. Why we need to have this country platform? Because we always receive a lot of interest from many institutions as well as players. And they come with their own idea, with their own mechanism. So having one country platform, it will also force to work together and also simplify the process. We receive huge support from the ADB as our crucial partner. The Indonesia Energy Transition Mechanism country platform representing a robust blended finance framework. How we are working with this Energy Transition Mechanism country platform? It creates a platform to work, for example, with the CIF ACT that pledged $500 million, highly concessional. This can be leveraged into $4 billion. But I will give you one very specific example of when we talk about how complex and how complicated the transition. We try to retire one power generation. This is coal-based, close to Jakarta, the Indonesian capital, and 660 megawatt. Indonesia total capacity of electricity is around 60 gigawatt. 660 megawatt, which operated supposed to be, this is IPP, that is Indonesia Power Purchase, that means this is owned by the private sector, which is supposed to be operated for 30 years, for 2012 to 2042. And if we are going to reduce the operation by 7 years, it will cost the PLN, that is the SOE, the state-owned company electricity, around $1.3 billion. So who's going to pay for this? We try to structure with the ADB, and it comes with the computation and the calculation of all those share of only retiring 7 years shorter for this coal power plant. It will cost us $1.3 billion. And that will be then need to be repackaged into a loan by the ADB, combining between concessional and non-concessional, a little bit grand. And that means the country Ministry of Finance have to borrow more. The PLN need to borrow more. So what is the role of the finance minister during this transition? First, you have to make sure that your fiscal policy is sound and prudent. Because if your fiscal situation is not sound and prudent, you cannot afford to even borrow more, even if it is concessional. And today we all know that more than 60 countries in the world, developing and emerging countries, they are in a highly debt exposure position, which is creating much less fiscal room for them to be able to financing this transition. So even when you have a strong and clear political will to reduce and to transition from the non-renewable into renewable, it will take quite a lot of what you call it necessary condition for you to be able to translate this commitment into action. And this will also, when you replace coal-based, which is reliable in supplying energy, into the non-renewable, it is not like 1 megawatt will be replaced by 1 megawatt. In this Cirebon, 660 megawatt, we have to build 3 times combined of the solar and also wind. That means we are going to have a much bigger investment to replace this 660 megawatt. Just to give you the magnitudes, so that I'm not going to provide you with the keynotes with the normative nice statement, because Indonesia has been working on this commitment, and we are going to into a very detailed transaction. So it will provide a platform as well as information for all parties to see and to know, to understand what does it take for us to translate this commitment into reality. But we are not only talking about this one micro project as an example, because at the end of the day, we need to scale up. So what is the role of Finance Ministry in order for us to be able to provide the right environment? First, we want to make sure that this is not a standalone action. So it needs to be put within the context of the policy framework. Indonesia working within our own, the taxonomy for sustainable financing, in order for us to provide not only signaling for the private sector, but also a framework for the private sector to participate in this very costly and expensive investment. With the taxonomy, there will be clarity about what an area that private sector are able to participate. And we put the climate mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity, and the transition of energy within this taxonomy. But we also understand that it cannot be just built, the taxonomy, within one country. So we work within the ASEAN. In this case, the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance, we've already issued the version 2 and now updated into version 3 on April this year during the Laos presidency of the ASEAN. We put 2 additional sectors, transportation and storage, and construction and real estate, in addition to the transition of energy within this taxonomy. So this is a signaling as well as a policy and regulation that will provide private sector to be able to participate in this transition of the energy toward a green and reducing the CO2. The role of Finance Ministry is also important on the cooperation and collaboration regionally and globally, like in ASEAN and within the G20. For example, the Indonesia, when we chair and hold the presidency of G20, we are also launching the G20 Transition Finance Framework. And for Indonesia as a host, we also launched the JETP. This is one of the mechanisms in which we work together, both bilaterally and with the multilateral institution, philanthropy, and private sector, to be able to provide a more explicit, not only just general policy framework, but a very explicit what will it take for us to deliver this transition. There are 5 critical pillars for enhancing financing for transition. First, identification of transitional activity. The second one, reporting mechanism. Third one, development of transition-related financing instrument, and designing policy measure. In this case, the Brazilian presidency of the G20 is going to continue advancing these 5 pillars. So that will be also providing a consistency of this principle. I would like to also give you one element that is also needed on the policy and regulatory framework. By giving you the example of this retiring earlier by 7 years of 660 megawatt, this retirement will only happen between 2035 to 2042. And I mentioned earlier, it will take 1.3 billion additional investment to replace that. But we haven't take into account the carbon credit of the reduction by around 28 million ton of the CO2. But the market for carbon currently is still very fragmented. The price is very uncertain. You can start with $2, $5, or $50, or in Canada, they maybe even have a higher. But it is still fragmented. And the second one, the carbon market future is not yet exist. So how you are going to make decision today when the benefit is going to be 20 years from now or 15 years from now, and the CO2 reduction cannot be capitalized yet because there is no market for the future carbon. So these are all what we call it the identification of how we are going to translate a good and strong commitment into reality. I think I will stop by saying that the role of finance ministry is very critical. Without involving and engaging finance ministry, you will end up with just the discussion of many climate change and transition, which many of the discussion, especially with the physical attendance, meaning that you are producing more CO2 rather than really reducing it. So for us to be able to deliver, I think the role of the finance ministry is very important. Designing the financing mechanism, creating instrument, working together in collaboration, both domestically with across ministries, local government, private sector, with across government, in this case, whether this is in a regional, ASEAN, or global, like what we've already done in Indonesia. And of course, the most important, whether the finance ministry will be able to attract more capital, which will require for any country to be able to invest more on even retiring the non-renewable and replacing with the renewable. And when I'm saying this, it's not only about replacing 1 megawatt with 1 megawatt, but the cost of the transition and distribution is going to be huge. This is just give you the closing for you to remember. Indonesia said that we have a lot of geothermal as well as hydro. But many of the river is in the bigger island like Kalimantan or Papua, which is 5-hour different or flight from Jakarta or Java. So you can imagine how costly the transition of this renewable into the destination that is the market. So these are all come up with then the cost of transmission and distribution and smart grid, even in this case by taking into account the intermittent of the non-renewable. These are all the area that finance ministry cannot just stay in the sideline. They need to understand so that they are able to support or even in this case engage actively in designing the right policy framework, even in this case innovate with the instrument in order for them to be able to show the case, then scaling up. So I do hope that this will help you in discussing further, but Indonesia will continue to be a country that will not only telling about the commitment and reducing the CO2, but we are doing a lot of our own homework. Try to work and implement and deliver to give the real example so that it is not going to just end up with the announcement of 20 billion JETP or any other 100 billion of Paris Agreement, but there is no reality. So to make them to be a reality, we have to work very detailed and complex on the financing side. Thank you so much.
That was excellent, as usual.
Thank you, Minister, for that keynote. It was at the same time hugely challenging, but also hugely inspiring, because it tells us that it's only, as you said, when we look the problem with the eye that we might find the solution. Otherwise, we will be at a very high level. The good news, at least for this afternoon, is we have a really good panel here to try and probe some of these issues. And I want to also not just only bring an emerging market perspective. I do think the emerging market perspective is very central, but also perspective from other elements of the world. And I want to really kind of turn this a little bit impromptu into, while your words are really fresh in our minds, to really get this panel to react in some sense to what you said. So I have prepared questions for them, but I think we should not miss the opportunity of a conversation, and I cannot think of better people to have this conversation with. So I'm going to begin with Laura, because Laura comes from Brazil, and Brazil is also facing similar. They are a little bit more blessed on the renewable energy side, but nevertheless, they also have an ecological transformation program that's very, very ambitious, very challenging. So if I could maybe begin with you, Laura, I mean, how did what the ministers say resonate? And also, again, all of this is about really how you have a pathway to both scale and to finance. So in the Brazilian context, how do you see that?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And while answering this question, I think it always resonates very much with the Brazilian context. And of course, now with the Brazilian presidency at the G20, we're seeing this connection between the domestic agenda and the international agenda that I think the presidency, the Indonesian presidency started in showing this link and trying to alleviate trade-offs between climate and development. This is really, I would say, the core issue that every country in the Global South is facing. We have possible complementarities between the climate transition and socio-economic goals. And in order to explore those complementarities and alleviate potential trade-offs, there is a big role to play for, of course, finance, and resources are crucial. The less resources we have, the more trade-offs we are going to face. This is very, very easy to see, and every time we have pushes for reform in the international financial architecture that end up exacerbating those trade-offs by putting climate at the expense of other budget items, I think we see problems arising and more obstacles. So I would say that finance ministries, and that's exemplified in some of the examples that have been brought by the minister, I think finance ministry have a role of also trying to integrate multiple goals in this climate transition and alleviate those trade-offs through domestic resource mobilization. And here I just want to stress, Laurence is here, that efforts of taxation and the discussion on taxation, both domestic taxation and international taxation, is core. And the Brazilians, I think, in this G20 presidency are playing an important role of bringing the wealth tax proposal together with climate finance and integrating these ideas. But yes, the socio-ecological transformation plan that the Brazilian Finance Ministry has launched, as well as new innovative instruments, for example, for reducing exchange rate risk, for local currency lending. These are all specific examples that I think show also the role of finance ministry and the connections between the domestic and the international level agendas.
Thank you, Laura. So, Nick, if I turn to you, more than anyone else, you have stressed the case for scale and urgency. And yet we hear that, in some sense, one of the impediments to that scale and urgency is finance. And you have co-chaired the independent high-level expert group, and that work really suggests that we need to be much, much more innovative in the way we bring pools of finance together. But what would your kind of take be, not only for Indonesia, but for other emerging markets as well, going through this imperative of a rapid transition?
Thank you, Sri Mulyani, and thank you, Amar. I should note that a great deal of what I say is very highly influenced by what Amar says and the analysis that he has done. That's one of the pleasures of life. I think there are a number of ways to respond to, and I'll try to, what Sri Mulyani said so clearly and strongly, but also to set this in the perspective of the challenges of other countries. If you have old coal-fired power stations, or you have very few coal-fired power stations, you're in an easier position to make that transition. So in the UK, we had a lot of old, not very good coal-fired power stations. In much of Africa, they've got not a lot in the way of energy supply. So the challenge is very different in those countries, different kinds of finance, different kinds of building. But for many Asian countries, middle-income countries, they have got quite a lot of young coal-fired power stations. So we have to look that problem as a world in the eye, because we're all dependent. We're particularly dependent on what middle-income countries, particularly in Asia, do. Putting it that way says that if you're looking at the finance capability of the world as a whole, including or even particularly through the MDBs, you've got to put that problem of middle-income countries in Asia with young coal-fired power stations at center stage. So if you look at the resources that we recommended in Vera Songwe will be here soon, I hope, the work with Amar, Vera, and myself, and we argued that the climate finance challenge involved financing investment of around $2.4 trillion a year in emerging markets and developing economies outside China. That purpose of climate finance, which is nested, of course, within SDG finance, is the energy transition, which, as Sri Mulyani emphasized, is the bulk of the money, but also adaptation and resilience, loss and damage, and natural capital. But the biggest part of it in the energy transition, and included in that, Amar, I hope I'm right, I've said it more than once before, is this kind of transition out of young coal-fired power stations. So the first observation is that this problem is a world problem and has to be put in the context of those challenges of finance. Within the 2.4 trillion, we said, roughly speaking, 1.4 trillion would be internal, domestic finance. Most investment is financed internally, but 1 trillion external. And of that 1 trillion external, a bit over half could be private, but you're talking of 300 million or so coming from the multilateral development banks, and an extra 150, 200 million or so coming from very low cost or zero cost finance. So first, it's a global challenge that the world has to be part of this finance story. And second, those are the basic elements in that. So it means, for example, that the multilateral development banks, which we argued that by the end of this decade will need to triple their lending, will have to get low-cost money to middle-income countries. That is part of the global response. There's an antipathy to that, but we have to look it in the eye and say the returns here are very high, the obligation is very clear, so we cannot say that we will not give low-cost finance to middle-income countries. We have to recognize that. And there's pushback from some shareholders who think somehow they're making off money with money that should be going to poorer countries. If we don't do this, I mean, the future of Africa is very closely tied to the reductions in emissions in the next 10, 20 years in Asia. So we have to see this as a global responsibility. We have to find low-cost money or zero-cost money, and that 150 billion or so that was the fourth element in what I described. First being domestic, the second being private, the third being MDBs, the fourth being the zero low-cost money. What kind of resources come? Well, overseas development aid, that we have to keep up the pressure. I'm not naive about how successful that will be, but we have to keep up the pressure. There's use of special drawing rights. There's philanthropy. There's new forms of taxation, which Laurence and her committee are going to deliver for us in a very clear and strong way, and we will support you, Laurence. I do think an international maritime tax has a real chance of flying. But the last element in that, and there may be more, but is the voluntary carbon markets. So suppose, let me pick a firm at random, call it Google or Alphabet. Suppose they decide that they want to offset a lot of their emissions ahead of the time where they can actually cut their emissions to directly zero. Well, if Indonesia has a major plan for revamping its energy sector along the lines described, even though the reduced emissions coming 7 years down the track, it seems to me that the voluntary carbon markets and the energy transition accelerator could contribute in a bulk way, also to South Africa or to Brazil, in a bulk way into these programs. And we should welcome that. We should not jump around saying, you're weaseling out of your commitments. No, your commitments are there. You're going to cut your emissions. That has to be monitored. They have to be held to account. But if in the meantime, serious flows of money can go into this kind of activity, then it would be good. Now, I'm not deluding myself that it'll be the biggest form of finance, but what we wanted to argue is if you put ODA, if you put the SDRs, if you put the voluntary carbon markets, if you put the philanthropy, if you put the new forms of taxation together, you've got 5 or 6 things, each of which could contribute a significant amount to close to zero-cost capital. And so that would be a significant part of the story. So my answer would be in 2 parts, really. The first part is the MDBs have to take the responsibility of giving low-cost money to middle-income countries for this kind of transition. And the second is we have to explore in an intensive way these very low-cost or zero-cost forms of finance and recognize that big parts of that would also have to go to middle-income countries.
Thank you, Nick. So as the minister stressed, I mean, a key challenge is scale and predictability of finance over a long period. As you said, how am I going to make a commitment? which is 10, 15 years if I don't know where that finance is coming from. And Laurence, if I turn to you, because you have really been our pioneer in this area and thinking now about ramping up, predictable, long-term, secure financing. And, I mean, waiting for donors to come up with that money has two challenges. One is you wait a long time, and second, you get commitment for a year. So, sorry, I shouldn't be so cynical about it, but that's the aid environment in which we live today. And it's, there are very good efforts being made, but we have to find sources of financing that are much more scalable and much more predictable than what we have. And carbon markets, as Nick said, including voluntary carbon markets or deployment of compliance markets, is one option. But the other are the kind of international taxation options that you are pondering and which the task force is going to consider. To what extent do you think that kind of finance could provide the solutions we are looking for in this accelerated transition?
Thank you, Amma, for these questions. And in a way, following all what was said, and I totally agree with what Nick said, it's a system. So we have to add elements in a context where there is a rationale for collective action and that each piece has to fall in the right place. So you can't do voluntary market on one side and nothing on the rest. It will not deliver. So that's a way, and that's why it's good to have a systemic view of the problem and the solution. I will start by the voluntary carbon market because I think it's a very important issue to solve. And as I said, we worked with Laura in Sao Paulo around the G20, and I think we are going in circles around the issue about integrity, about the way we calculate it, about the prices. And my advice to the Brazilian government is say, this is it, this is a rule we're proposing, that's done, and now we can revise after 2 or 3 years if it's going well. Because we are now, how many years we are talking about that? And as you said, Minister, you have prices that go from $2 to 100, and when you look at the internal costs, the social costs that companies are putting, in the main companies I know, put a social carbon price for the investment, which is always above 100 euro. It's more around 100 euro 50. So we can't continue doing that. And finally, all the money being taken by the intermediaries mostly. So it's not a solution, and it has to be fixed. I think, again, the discussion between all the experts doesn't deliver. So I think that's why a government would say, look, I propose, because of my presidency, this is a role at COP30. We finish the discussion. This is it. And we make an assessment 3 years after. I think it's really be very helpful for all the community because we are losing so much time doing that sometimes I'm really furious about the time we are talking about and talking and talking. And again, the minimum price should be there. That's evident because it's very difficult. It's a market without really a fixed quantity. So we should have a floor price like you did in UK, by the way. Huh? So that's one, and really I think we should push for that. I do think that when I look at the European situation, of course, the fiscal space of governments is really very zero. We have been struggling to fund the implementation of the European policy. So that's why I think we need, and again, because it's systemic approach, we need to break that taboo on international taxation. Doesn't mean that it is not a sovereign decision to put a tax. That's normal. That's the Minister of Finance to decide. But I think there is a vast area of global flows that are not contributing to the solution of global public goods. And on top of that, even global flows that contribute to the pollution and don't pay for it. So maritime is a good example. When I look at the profit of the maritime companies, some are not listed. That's not fair. They are polluting. That's a lot, no? The pollution because of maritime. And really, they are not really helping decarbonize that sector. And in a way, paying, the simple principle of polluters pay principle. So I think that's one example. And when we look at all the option, aviation in particular on the first and business class ticket, maybe some form of the tax on financial flows. Some countries are using it, small ones. And even when I look again at the profit of oil and gas companies, again, because of the invasion of Ukraine, the companies in 2023 have multiplied their profit by 4, being 1 trillion profit that are in 4 trillion profit in 1 year. So windfall profit are really enormous. And who is paying that? Governments that are subsidizing the consumption of fossil fuel, because of course socially it's impossible not to help the household or in the industry to absorb the shock. So I think there is a number of reforms that can be acceptable if, as Nick said, everybody does his job properly. And I think when we calculate all the resources, each of these taxes can raise between 150 to 200 or even more billion a year. So I think it could be a beginning of all the system we are building. Taking that could be an element, and that could be money used by governments for that transition and to leverage private capital, which is, of course, as we need to. So I think there is, again, when I proposed that to President Macron, President Ruto, of course, I was thinking they would never accept that. And, the reality makes that now people are reconsidering. So I'm hopeful. I know it will be super difficult, and, that's life.
We have an opening now, which under your leadership we have to use. I want to switch gears and quite briefly talk a little bit more about the domestic challenge. Every country has these two trains running now side by side, a fossil fuel economy and in some sense a potential new economy. And that creates as this theme of this dynamics. And there's a European dynamic, there's a Brazilian dynamic, and there's an international dynamic. So I want to ask Laura about the Brazilian dynamic. I'll come to you for the European dynamic and then to Nick for the international dynamic. But Laura, in the case of Brazil, it's really going full steam, but there's also still quite a lot of, pursuit of fossil fuels. How does that play out in the political economy in Brazil?
Yeah. Now, I think that's a very difficult topic for countries that are fossil fuel extractors and of course face big dilemmas in the short run, even when they commit to transition. And I think Brazil is one of those that I think at least the current government has clear commitment to climate goals. Of course, it has still a lot of coordination problems in terms of the different ministries and the different mandates. Sometimes it's hard to have an agenda that is integrated, and I think the role of finance ministry here comes again, because sometimes it acts as that coordinating entity. So you have the state oil company, you have the development bank, you have the finance ministry, you have the Ministry of Environment, each of them with policies and transition policies on their own, right? And sometimes it's hard to make sense of this as an agenda. And I think that's one of the challenges that we still have in many developing countries. But it is a very difficult agenda. You've seen Colombia recently announcing that it won't extract oil anymore, and how it was punished by international financial markets. Credit ratings went up, the borrowing costs went up immediately. So it's not just a matter of domestic decision, right? We don't live in an environment, both from the financial side and possibilities, and also from the political domestic from the political perspective, that favors sudden decisions to stop extracting. So it's a problem that has to do with how we phase this out and how we use the resources that the oil, the fossil fuels give to finance this transition. I think this is the right conversation. And we're getting there in Brazil. The conversation is there. Of course, there are conflicting views, but there is a sense that we need to, in the short run, use the resources that the oil sector gives to fund a transition and to implement the investments that we need to implement. I think the political economy question here is very important because we talk about finance a lot as the binding constraint for climate transitions in the South. But maybe the political constraint is at least as relevant and as important. And maybe in some contexts for a country like Brazil that issue debt in its own currency, has access to capital markets, that is not in a situation of default risk or immediate problems. Of course, we have fiscal rules that are very tight, but if we compare Brazil to even neighboring countries or for sure Africa countries in general, it has a comfortable fiscal situation, right? And maybe the binding constraint is not the fiscal. There, the political is very important. And I just want to stress here how there is that perception that anti-environmentalists take advantage of and instrumentalize and polarize around climate because of that perception, I would say, and we lived that in Bolsonaro's government in Brazil, right, very much. There is a general perception that, one, wealthy nations are not doing what they should be doing and are asking from the Global South to engage in the transition when they are not contributing their fair share, they're responsible for historical emissions, right? This is the perception of the population.
Thank you. We have been told, I've been told that we have to draw this part to a close. I want to give Laurence and Nick a word.
That's fine.
Ross, I just want to come to the European conundrum because, particularly after Ukraine, you were leading on the European Green Deal in a very major way. And then, of course, Ukraine happened and, the insecurity on energy. Now, when you look at it, there seems to be both glimmers of hope and cries of despair. So, how do you see the way ahead in Europe where Europe can, in some sense, again, lead really by example in this managing the transition?
And trying to be brief, the Green Deal emerged and resisted to the first COVID crisis, which was a COVID crisis. But then has many consequences of the relation with Europe and others because of the vaccine problems, which I think was... So that was one element. The second one, of course, the invasion of Ukraine. And then that's why the subsidies on fossil fuel just are skyrocketing. Almost 1 trillion we spend on fossil fuel subsidies now, which is, of course, ridiculous given if you compare what we invest in renewable energy. And by the way, fortunately, there was enough renewable energy to allow us to diversify our source of energy, in particular to cut imports from Russia of gas. Now, of course, because of the same polarization that Laura is describing, it happens in Europe that the Green Deal has to resist the other crisis, which is a prolongation of the war, the inflation that has, of course, been the consequence. The Polish society has framed a very interesting concept, which is the Putinflation. And that's true. The price of food, the price of oil, the price of gas were, of course, a result of this crisis. So now we are in front of the European election in 9th of June, and we have a big battle about, the pro-European, pro-democracy, pro-clean energy movement against, of course, backlash forces. And that's really a moment where we realize that we have to, of course, offer a new chance, a new project for Europe, and it has to be the Green Deal. So for the moment, the political economy, the politics are much more important than the economics, really, frankly. We need certainly a new financial instrument to fund this enormous investment we are facing. But we have the resources, the technology, but in reality, we have to fight against the one who doesn't want to invest that, because in a way, if we don't do that, we keep importing solar panels from China or everything. So I think that's a moment of choice. That's why the campaign is so heated, and I hope we'll have a resistance of the European project again after this new element.
Thank you, Nick. I give you the last word. I mean, how do we, really get the international dynamic and particularly the link to growth and development in the present context?
Thank you. I think we need a shared understanding of strategy, policy, finance, and how to collaborate. And the first part of the story is, as you emphasized, if we have to understand that investing strongly and well in the new and the clean and increasingly cheap is the growth story of the 21st century. Think about how the understanding in Paris changed things. Paris led us all to think that the world was going to look very different. And that vision fostered a real acceleration in the new technologies. So shared understanding makes a big difference to the way in which technologies appear, and indeed in which policies appear. So that combination of growth and development on the one hand and climate action on the other is something that's in our hands. We can make a mess of it, or we can do it well. But if we do it well, it's a very powerful growth story. Secondly, through the coalition of finance ministers, for example, demand-side management can be very strong. Through standards for efficiency, through prices, through the right kind of regulation, and so on. And the coalition of finance ministers is already showing itself a powerful weapon for operating on the demand side. The finance side I've already gone over, but the multilateral development banks and tripling by the end of this decade what they can bring to the table and working much more closely with the private sector is fundamental. And it's very cheap. And Amar and Homi and the others have done the sums. You don't have to put very much into these institutions to greatly expand their lending capability. That should be a priority. I think a coherence on the rundown, I've spoken about the demand side, but the objective clearly, and it said it last year in Dubai, is to run down, let me speak particularly of the oil and gas. That means by 2035, it has to be substantially less than what it is now. And that means that a lot of people who are producing it now will be out of the market in 2035. It's amazing how they all think they're going to be the last people standing. They can't be. And what we need to have is a public discussion of reasonable assumptions how fast it's going to fall, and an understanding of who's going to survive in the oil and gas supply. Again, understanding can lead to action. I think a scrutiny of the oil companies as to what they're actually doing and where are their big profits going. Again, I think that public scrutiny, public accountability, everybody understanding how much they're putting into oil and gas and how much they're putting into renewables will be very important. Finally, let me say something that might be a bit controversial, but China has got tremendous spare capacity at the moment in a lot of these goods. China's got the ability to help with finance. It seems to me China's got examples that people can follow. If the rest of the world helped China sell very cheap stuff, whether it's solar panels or something, to poorer nations of the world, that would be a great step forward. So that involves collaboration of, we hear about the global north and the global south. China's such a big player in all this that we ought to be thinking of how the countries of the world, not this bloc or that bloc, can work with China to take advantage of the very low-cost supplies which could be available.
Thank you, Nick. We have time for a couple of questions. I know that there are roving mics, so I just want to take a quick look. I'm looking for some gender balance so I can go, but I'll do it in the order. So I've seen the hands, so I'm going to go 1, 2, and 3.
What role do you, my name is Ujjwal, I'm from U.S. Customs. What role do you think customs agencies can play in terms of collaborating with finance ministries to perhaps set up incentive schemes at the ports that encourage private enterprises and other businesses to engage in more sustainable trade practices, or perhaps even like taxes, or come up with sort of financial instruments that can encourage a more sustainable transition, especially given how important global emissions are to affecting the climate?
Thank you very much. A great panel. My name is Kaveh. I lead the international work at CTUS here in Washington, D.C. I think what Laura was going to say on the political economy point was that the dynamic on finance in the international arena seems to be very simplistic and divisive. And I think the recurring theme that the minister started with and others have really emphasized is that the public sector finance is important, but is not going to be sufficient by any stretch of the imagination. Yet COP29 inevitably is going to focus probably almost entirely on what the update to the 100 billion goal is going to be. So it would be interesting to hear what the panel thinks about how COP29 could add value. And I think it's interesting that no one's actually mentioned COP29 at all, which I think shows where the real finance conversation is happening.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Irving Mincer. I'm with the University of Maryland's Stern School of Business and the Closing the Investment Gap Initiative. I want to come back to Nick Stern's and Madame Tibiana's remarks about finding new sources of finance to fill this gap, and in particular, to draw our attention to the potential role of institutional investors as the guardians of the global savings pool. I wonder if there might be an opportunity for finance ministries to signal to private investors their desire to leverage private sector investment in climate-smart, sustainable infrastructure by working with central banks to integrate climate considerations into the final rules for implementation of Basel III. Not sure how best to meet this challenge in Indonesia, but here in the US, as one example, an element of this opportunity could include using the rules for Basel III to provide incentives for banks to recognize secure investments in high-quality, sustainable infrastructure, underwriting renewable energy and energy efficiency as counting towards their Tier 1 core capital requirements. This would provide an incentive for those banks to make low-cost, if not zero-cost loans that would support the initial installation and construction of that infrastructure.
Yeah. Laurence?
Just picking up what you said about central banks, there was a lot to discuss anyway, and effectively we could raise the issue about COP29. The central banks, as you said, has to play a very central role. On one, of course, of the accountability of all the supply chain, and that's why we need all these efforts that are taking place everywhere, no? And I do think that we can do even more now in that prospect to have the central banks really accountable of what they finally, how they ensure the financial stability, including that. And again, because of the politics, the move we have seen in the central banker discussion is probably now going a little backwards, and including maybe in IMF, that's a question mark, that finally the macro risks as climate represent may be not considered as important. So there is an element of battle there which is really important, just to make the case because it's so evident. The second one is, and that's some of our expert group on we're gathering. There was an interesting discussion from a central banker, a former central banker, that central banks are relying on enormous amount of capital. So it's not very used in a very dynamic way, if I may say so. So if ask the MDBs to do more, we could look at the central banks and say, look, we are in a big moment where we have to face enormous investment, and you should do your part. And so that's a very interesting conversation. I think it's a moment to have it, because for the moment they have a little bit more hesitancy. Even you see that ECB, Christine Lagarde is fighting really tooth and nails to continue to have a mandate for climate. And I think we should support this initiative because, again, they are the last resort on financial stability. And on COP29, maybe it's a too long discussion, so I don't want to monopolize the discussion.
Nick?
I agree with what Laurence has just said. And we have Vera with us now. Maybe you should ask Vera afterwards. She'll enlighten you, I'm sure, on this. But the rules are based on backward look, which misjudge what risks really are. So I think taking a forward look in the story of where we know the system's going to change is actually justified at this point, and to reassess through the regulatory structure, or to inform the regulatory structure, how risky the different kinds of activities are. And I think looking backwards, we get the wrong picture. And there's basic second best public economics that tells you if you've got a really bad market failure in one place of the economy, you should be duty bound to take that into account across the whole of activities. So I sometimes call the discussions around central banking and so institutional fundamentalism, which is just as bad as market fundamentalism. Yeah, and it basically ignores second best public economics. I mean, it's just wrong. So on what replaces 100 billion, I think it's the wrong question. I think what kind of international finance are we going to need over this next decade or so? And Vera and Amar and I tried to answer that question. I actually described the flows a little earlier on. I said we're going to need, by 2030, 1 trillion of external flows, but it is not some kind of bucket that's created into which everybody has a dip. It is actually a collection of different sources of finance, which we've discussed at a number of points this afternoon, which need to be combined. But at the core of that combining will be the multilateral development banks. They will help the allocation of the low-cost or zero-cost money. They will work with the private sector. So we shouldn't say, how is the 100 billion being replaced? We should see that as a historical period in history, not always very distinguished. And we should ask the question, how do we create a new system of external finance for these issues? On the customs, I think the CBAM is a good idea, provided it's kept really simple, so no dirty deeds can be done in covert protectionism. So not too many sectors, and focus on simple measurement criteria.
Laura?
Yeah, I think on the political economy piece, again, beyond, I think there is a growth story of the 21st century, Nick, and maybe that's the main way to overcome the political obstacle, and maybe that's what where I wanted to get to. So this perception that countries in the north or the financial system or multilaterals are not doing what they should be doing or not delivering, plus the perception that there is a cost in the short run for doing climate action. I think these are two very powerful ideas in the global south that end up acting as a barrier to adoption of these transition plans. And I think finance is one way to alleviate that environment and create another thing. But the other way is to have agendas, growth agendas that deliver on inequality reduction, on jobs. And the way we talk about finance sometimes, and even the type of finance that we talk about, sometimes don't integrate these goals and don't see these goals as complementary. And that's a problem, because there's no point in having resources that are not flexible enough for governments to act on these multiple goals.
Thank you. I should give Vera the last word. I said I should, because you've made such a valiant effort to be here. but it would not be fair on you because you have not really, listen, have opportunity to listen. I just want to say that much of what we discussed here, things that you have contributed greatly to, and we'll carry on the conversation this week. I want to really conclude by a real warm vote of thanks to Minister and Cool for kicking this off, and to this great panel for a wonderful discussion. So if you join me in thanking them. Thank you all for coming in the late afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.